Hello, everyone. Thank you all. Everything you've all been talking about is extremely fascinating, and I think it's a fascinating aspect of what kind of seems like one half of the equation, because all the things that are being talked about, alchemy and enlightenment, we're talking about them. You're talking about them from a scientific point of view. But they really have their origins in the completely opposite tradition of spirituality. And so, Jeffrey, we talked about this before, but I'm wondering, Natasha, you talked about alchemy and this guy in China feeding the stuff to his dog. But the really interesting thing about alchemy is that ultimately, I'm pretty sure that the alchemists decided that they made a really big mistake and that they shouldn't have been taking alchemy literally in terms of eating physical things. And we're in Hong Kong, and I guess it's apropos because there's this guy Charles Luke Kuan Yu, who translated a work that he entitled in English Taoist Yoga, in which he talks about Taoist internal alchemy, Neidan, manipulating the internal energies around the chakras, and the result of this is immortality, but it's the revelation of the immortality of the non-physical self. So they're going for kind of the eternal self, but not from the physical perspective, not of the physical body. So you guys are all talking about the possible eternal physical self. Where do these two things meet? We're all the way over now in terms of physical immortality. The real possibility, finally, of the alchemical metaphor being not a metaphor anymore, but being real for the first time in human history. How can these two things
Let's
meet?
hear the speaker's responses.
Since you mentioned my name, I'll answer it. Thank you. My primary interest in alchemy is just to situate cybernetics going back to a specific point in time where the idea of life extension arose. And I had always thought it was the Egyptians, but it wasn't. I was wrong. It was the Taoists in China. And I think that is the beginning point. So it's always necessary to situate a research project in a certain beginning point. But there is no ever any real beginning, and there is never a real end. So it's always a continuous process. What interested me was transformation and the chemistry aspect of it, and how we are today back to chemistry again, and looking at regenerative medicine, looking at how to regenerate ourselves, not only in biology through regenerative medicine such as Aubrey's doing, but also in cryonics, regenerating, transmutating a body into a liquid nitrogen, into a state of liquid nitrogen, and then reanimating back. This is all dealing with chemistry. Not only that, the idea of the media is the narrative message. I want to emphasize the narrative is a bit about chemistry as well, as a transformation of ideas and the unknown and the unknowable, as what Fedorov was very interested in. So it's all about chemistry indeed, and it's all about transmutation. So I don't think science is a part of it, but it's not the most important part. But by the way, alchemy started out as one thing and it turned into something else. So alchemy was split. It went into the metaphysics stuff and it went into the science stuff. So you have chemistry stemming from the proto-science and then the metaphysics.
I'd like to hear Gino's response.
So, Doug, let me just briefly say that my response to that, before I turn it over to Gino for the rest of the evening, is simply that in our subjects, they no longer fear death, right? But that does not mean that they want to die, right? So, the huge, one of the significant benefits, of course, is a tremendous loss of fear in these individuals, the type that you're talking about from spiritual traditions, which I, of course, argue are certainly only a percentage of those who have experienced this. So it's not always situated within that type of spiritual type framework by any means. But nonetheless, if you ask them, well, would you like to keep living? I mean, certainly there's no desire for them to end this experience. This experience is an amazing thing that's unfolding moment to moment for them. So I don't think that they're going to have any objection necessarily to Ben or Aubrey or anyone else succeeding with making them live longer in that state that they experience.
It's all story. Making up for before, so you're having grief. Where do the two sides meet? Well, they don't. I think it's a matter of one transmuting into the other. The early alchemists, I'm not very familiar with the Chinese ones, I confess, but the early alchemists I'm familiar with were proto-scientists. They didn't have scientific methods, so they had great goals of trying to fly, transmute the elements, and immortality, but they don't have the right methodology. So to me, those two don't meet, because the idea of an immortal soul that's totally non-physical, to me, we have no reason to believe in that. Instead, what we have now is something a little better grounded than that we have at least a possibility that we can live indefinitely, not necessarily tied to this particular body. That doesn't mean we don't need some kind of body. So it's kind of a liberation from necessarily being human or stuck in one biological body. Perhaps we can upload it from a different platform. So we're really the successors of that spiritual view, in my view. We're not really trying to meet it unless you put it in that perspective. So I think we can do just as well. In fact, we can do better, because one thing that always puzzles me about people who believe in heaven and look forward to going to heaven is if you sit down, and I did this a lot with my students in philosophy of religion, I'd ask them, okay, describe to me what this heaven is like that you're so eager to go to. And then their face kind of goes blank and they start looking worried because they realize they haven't a clue what it's like. They have no idea. They're very eager to get there, but they don't know what it's going to be like. We don't really have a clue what our virtual worlds will be like in the future, but presumably we can actually affect what they'll be like and design them. So if anything, I think our alternative is maybe a better one.
Sorry, I just want to add something, take a slightly different view on a few things there. The point is, if you have all these life extension strategies, it's not going to get rid of evil, right? And if you open it, it's obviously going to be opened up to everybody, right? These therapies, so people will live whatever X thousand years. That just gives people more of a chance to think about, causing good and causing bad as well. The real issues that I'm really thinking about, transhumanism is a wonderful, optimistic, view of the world at the end of the day. But think of it, the same technological advances that are happening may well give each one of us the means to destroy the planet individually. If you look at it, the technology already exists. It's just that now certain rogue states are getting a hold of it, and eventually it'll become cheaper and more accessible to individuals. At that point, just think about it. There's 7 billion of us, right? If each one of us had the ability to destroy the planet with the push of a button, I would bet you we would cease to exist.
It's called suicide.
Yeah, but suicide is individual. But if they have the technology in their hand, they will. Yeah, but they will kill they will just shut down the planet, right? The whole point is that, at the same time that you're, actually, transhumanism is an imperative because technology is going to enable destructive power. So you need to find a way to actually transform humanity before that power is in the hands of at the individual level.
Yeah, hi, I'm Ravi from Singapore. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for 5 very entertaining presentations, and I think they deserve another round of applause. Yes, and on to my question. This is probably more with regards to the first speaker, Max, regarding religion. Have any of you encountered what's the most common or pervasive religious objection you have encountered to transhumanism? And secondly, do you consider Noah to be the first transhumanist? Because according to the Bible, he lived to 950 years old. I think that's Noah. Yeah.
Noah lived pretty long, but yeah, Methuselah is the guy who lived over 900. There are actually, I think, probably like a dozen characters in the Bible who are named who lived 400, 500, 600 years. As the question about the opposition from religion, actually, it's interesting that most of the opposition, I think, comes in the form of lack of comprehension. They don't really get that. When I've actually talked to religious people, I found that they can be brought around to the view that there isn't really any contradiction here. For instance, an extending lifespan, maximum lifespan, there's nothing you can see really in any of the major religions that makes that clearly contraindicated. In fact, looking in the Bible, we're just catching up to what the Bible has, right? We're just catching up to the patriarchs who lived these several centuries. And you can always pick the right passages, right? You can pick the passages from the Bible where Jesus is saying, away goes along and resurrects somebody, brings them back from the dead. He gives them allows them to live again, as I was talking about yesterday. And he says, go forth and do as I have done. That's what we're doing. So really, there are no direct contradictions. You can see that religion's actually quite good at evolving. Like Catholicism, it's evolved to accept certain things like evolution and other ideas. So they're actually very flexible because they want to survive. I mentioned Mormonism earlier. That seems to be actually very friendly, potentially at least, to transhumanism. There may be some fundamentalist versions of religion which are not so much. But I don't think it doesn't really have to be opposition. I think you can mix these transhumanist ideas with the religions. And I personally would welcome, instead of polarizing us versus them, I would like to see them embrace parts of our ideas and us be friendly to them and welcome them on board. They may not come the whole way, but if it stops their opposition to life extension technologies and other enhancements, that's a good thing.
This isn't specifically religion, but I think it is driven by a religious perspective, and that is a comment about dignity, human dignity, and our dignity surfacing from our genetic makeup, and that to tamper with our genes in any way would weaken the level of efficacy of being a human, and that's was the statement of Professor and Dr. Fukuyama in consequence to transhumanism. And I think that element of dignity, there's some kind of purest human, it's a kind of a worshiping of our genes to stay, normal. And I think normal according to what our genes are and not to tamper with them. So I think that does derive from religion. Am I correct or wrong when you think?
Actually, not really in my view, because these people, they may have religious beliefs, but you can find many others of the same beliefs who don't see it the same way. A good example, especially, is Fukuyama's buddy Leon Katz, who's Jewish and has written an essay on why he spoke to many other Jewish scholars who are all quite happy about transhumanist ideas and have no problem with it. He's kind of annoyed about that because he thinks they shouldn't dislike it. But Judaism is all about celebrating life and living life, and if life is good. He doesn't understand why his fellow Jews don't dislike the idea of immortality. He wrote a whole essay on this piece. So I don't think it's actually their religious views that's causing that opposition. It's their particular prejudices, which don't have any direct grounding, as far as I can tell, in religion.
How could that be grounded in religion unless there is a religion that worships the genes? Worships.
And actually, his views are quite consistent with that of humanists who are not religious. They don't have any supernatural beliefs. But humanists are very much split 50-50 pretty much between those who are quite sympathetic to transhumanist ideas and those who don't like it at all, because they are humanists. We better stay human, damn it. None of this transhumanist stuff. We've got to worship the state of humanity, and we have to justify pain and suffering and death and all the things that are part of the human condition. Why, I'm not really sure, but they're very adamant about that.
I have a question.
So we had some talks discussing enlightenment and related states of extraordinary well-being. I think these are fascinating, amazing states of consciousness, which are different than the ordinary human, everyday waking state of consciousness. They're worth studying. To some extent, I agree they're worth pursuing, but I don't feel drawn personally that much to become an enlightened bachelor. Maybe I'm just too unenlightened to even want it, right? But one thing that makes me curious is the extent to which advanced technologies such as mind uploading, brain-computer interfacing, brain modification, cyborgization with AGIs, the global brain, the extent to which these may enable other states of consciousness, kind of different than ordinary human waking consciousness and different than the enlightened states of consciousness that we see in humans now. And of course, saying one state of consciousness is better than another is a value judgment, and I don't even see the need to go there. But I'm interested in the space of alternate types of experience that may be enabled by various H+ technologies. And I wonder if anyone has anything to say about that.
Only through drugs. Experience with drugs.
I would say that we don't know, you know, until you're there you don't know. It's like being explorers, but I think the closest thing that one could parallel, perhaps even naively, would be taking, you know, psilocybin or, you know, doing ecstasy or doing any type of mind-altering interface that would create a different perception than this real-time reality
Those
that
are
we know.
short-lived, so what would be different is these modifications
Yeah.
could keep on going. Right?
Yeah, exactly. But, I mean, isn't it kind of exciting to think if there's another level of consciousness? I mean, you're interested in consciousness, what do you think?
Well, I know Ben, we've had tons of conversations like this. But the interesting discussion that we had in the whole, I showed a picture of Onira, my daughter, and my wife, of really looking at, and one of the earlier discussions that Jeffery and I had in, it was in Pittsburgh, was really looking at arguably all of the, if you're into this whole embodied consciousness thing where, you know, it's around us somewhere versus kind of panpsychism and, you know, all of this other stuff, is that all of your experiences are actually in your physiology, you know, at born. And right now, the interesting model that we're really looking at is as you start experiencing the world, it's mapping these physiological states of all of the whatever trillion atoms that are cells that are you, and all the bacteria that you're carrying around as well too, you know, that are not you, that homeostasis of that stuff. Right. There's some kind of state of that, an experience of that gets mapped into some idea and opinion. And as things seem to happen out here, or as you take whatever chemicals that alter that chemistry or whatever, then new revelations or experiences seem to happen. Even when you're dreaming, things are happening that then map into some kind of memory thing that you're doing as well too. So arguably, even when you're a baby, it's all there, but it's just arguably it's all there, but it's undifferentiated.
You know, I wonder, since you're into design and media too, you know, you think about the film Vanilla Sky, and what's the other film that was recent, I can't remember, where he's having he takes a drug and he becomes smarter than he is. Limitless. I mean, you know, we see these films and it's very interesting, and then if you go into gaming and have certain experiences, I think that those are hints as to what it could be like, but I think we need more of that, more experiences through gaming and experience design, especially, to go into these other environments and just see how our consciousness can change.
Yeah, I very much agree with Ben that, you know, when we upload into God only knows what other architecture, who the heck knows what our consciousness is going to be. But I'm confident that, you know, there's some chance that I'll be around long enough to move on to that research project after this one.
Great. Actually, we have time for two more.
Jeffery, could you say more?
Louder, please.
Could you say more about these happy people? Like, are they born or made, or how do they live differently from us? And if they're made, how do they make themselves work? And do they, for those who weren't happy and now they are happy, do they feel it's a more desirable life to be happy? Can you just generally say more? And sort of...
Well, so far the only thing that they really have in common is Natasha's ecstasy. It has this, no, I'm kidding. It's about 50% that have used hallucinogens, so it's not, so there isn't a hallucinogenic basis. There's no statistical significance for any mental or spiritual practice. We've just looked statistically at so many different things, right? And the triggers right now elude us, which is really why we're looking in the brain. But to just sort of take some of your questions and move through them as quickly as possible here. So, generally speaking, no, they don't want to go back. But it depends on where they land, right? So although there's a developmental continuum, you can sort of have this switch flip in you, and it really does feel like a completely different change has occurred to you. So 1 minute you are experiencing this individual sense of self, the next minute a switch flips, and you're experiencing something completely different. But what that something completely different is, could be at the beginning, or the middle, or sort of the further reaches of it. You could stay in the spot that you land in for the rest of your life, as far as we can tell, or you might move further along it, or you might choose that this isn't for me. So just as a good example for the this isn't for me, because I think people are very surprised to hear that there are people out there like this. You know, there's this idea that people spend their entire lives striving to reach enlightenment in some various religions and spiritual circles or whatever, so it must be something that you'd never want to get rid of. But there are people who experience a drop from their ordinary life immediately into the far reaches of it. And the far reaches of it are very different. There's no emotion, which means that there's no personal love, right? So one person, just as an example, who happened to be a friend of mine, described the experience happening to him. And he just basically read a book about enlightenment. He can't even remember what book it was. But it wasn't a very heavy book. It didn't discuss where he landed in any way or anything like that. He had no conceptual framework for where he wound up. Went to sleep, woke up the next morning, and literally he was in a very sort of a place that's very consistently described for us, but sort of on the very further reaches of it, right? And it's a place where you have no sense of agency, you have no self-thoughts, you have no emotion, and as a result of that, it feels incredibly free. And it produces a sense of well-being unlike anything that you or I could ever think about discussing or imagining or whatever, as these people describe it. However, for him, he got up and he was pretty convinced that he'd gone crazy or that something had happened to his brain. And he went downstairs, which is often what happens when people don't have a spiritual or whatever framework for this to put this in. They often think, wow, I've gone crazy, My whole sense of self has changed so radically. Something must be wrong. Doug you heard ask a question earlier, is a psychologist, and his crowd, clinical psychologist, and his crowd calls them spiritual emergencies. It's actually in the codus of mental disorders now because it's common enough. So he looks at his daughter across the breakfast table and thinks to himself, you're still here. And then he sort of conceptualizes that, wow, I have no personal love for my daughter anymore. And he began sort of an intellectual search for whether or not that was the way he really wanted to experience life. And because it wasn't that cemented into his physiology yet, he could unwind it. It took him 3.5 months. And he describes the several years since then as the, happiest years, for lack of a better word, of his life. So this is what I'm trying to express to you, is that this is a very complicated topic, and that the answer is no. Not everyone that gets to one of these states chooses to stay in one of those states. Ethically, if we find an on-switch for a state, from a research perspective, I don't think we can release it or, make it more broadly available or even use it until we find the off-switch for that state, sort of because of this type of thing. But the vast majority of people, the 99.9% of people who land into one of these states would never, ever want to go back. So there are exceptions to that. And it's when so far the only exceptions have been when there's been that level of extreme change. Does that answer most of your questions, or?
Yeah.
We better wrap up.
Okay, Ravi.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add something. I mean, I just want to bring that down to physiologically what it means. If you actually think about the human animal, we are really an exercise in avoiding pain. That's how we evolved, right? On the savannah, basically you don't want to put yourself in situations where pain is costly because that usually results in, in a fatal incident. So the people who survived and who we are now descendants of are the ones who quickly reacted to pain by running away or avoiding it in some way, shape, or form. And if you look at the root cause of a lot of illness today, not just mental illness, but physical manifestations of mental of illness, whether it's immune reactions or whatever, there's a basis behind it which is physiologically attributed to pain. Post-traumatic stress disorder is the most famous of them, but there's a lot more than that. When you actually, we look within ourselves and think about any illness that we have, there is probably a trigger that is related to an emotional experience, which is related to pain avoidance. So what he's describing effectively is the absence of that. When the human being is sort of detached from that concept of, I'm not going to be pained by my neighbor making more money than me, or by attachment and the pain of that comes from the removal of that attachment, and so many other things in this world, right? Then you can start begin to understand what that enlightened state may be. But fundamentally, I think it is, your whole concept of pain just disappears, from the rest of you. So your mind is free to really explore a lot of other things.
Let me just have 10 seconds.
10 seconds.
And it's not a rebuttal of Ravi in any way. I just want to say, I did an interview on a website called Buddhist Geeks. It's like 2.5, 3 hours of material. I don't know how it was chopped down into a couple of parts. But if you really want to get like more in-depth information about your question, maybe. And of course, feel free to email me.
Great. Okay. 2 quick announcements.